He thought she was nobody. That's what started it all. A routine morning, a near-empty courtroom, and a cop whose arrogance had always been his armor. He didn't know her name. He didn't ask. He didn't care, because the uniform made him feel like a king, and everyone not in one was just background noise. So when she walked in, quiet, composed, dressed like any other clerk or assistant, he didn't pause, didn't consider. He raised his voice, and then without hesitation, he raised his hand. The sound of that slap didn't just echo off the courtroom walls, it broke something. It snapped the illusion that power could always protect you, that entitlement would always shield you. For a heartbeat, everything stood still. The lawyers froze, pen suspended mid-air. The clerk's hand hovered over her keyboard. A coffee cup teetered on the edge of a desk and stayed upright, but just barely. The kind of silence that feels like holding your breath before a storm. And then she turned to face him, slow, steady, unflinching. And in that one glance, his world started to come apart at the seams. He didn't know it yet. He still thought this was a misunderstanding, still thought he could talk his way out, lean on the right connections, file the right report. But every second that passed with her staring back at him was a countdown, a clock ticking toward consequences he'd never had to face, not once in his career. Because no matter how many reports had come across her desk with his name, no matter how many cases she'd seen him involved in today, he wasn't a name on paper. Today, he was standing in front of the one person he should have never touched. And that one action, that one slap, it lit the fuse. She didn't yell, she didn't flinch, she didn't even raise her voice. She just walked past him, walked to the front of the courtroom, climbed the platform, took her seat behind the bench. And when she spoke again, every head turned, every phone came out, every excuse he could have made started to crumble in his throat. Because now the robe was on. Now the title was clear. And now the question wasn't whether he'd get away with it. The question was, how far would she go to expose everything he stood for? She had spent decades in that building. She knew its history better than its blueprints, the cracks in the marble, the echoes in the halls, the whispers that traveled faster than facts. She'd heard them all, and she'd survived them all. Not because the system welcomed her, but because she refused to be broken by it. Long before she sat on that bench, she fought uphill battles every single day. As a defense attorney for clients, no one believed. As a prosecutor trying to clean out corruption from the inside. And finally, as a judge, appointed not because of who she knew, but despite who tried to stop her. She had faced enough sideways glances to build a bridge with them, heard the condescending tone wrapped in politeness, the veiled insults dressed up as compliments. She knew exactly what it meant when people said, "You're so well-spoken," with surprise. She had been the first black woman to sit on that court's highest bench, and from the day she took that seat, the silence was louder than applause. Not everyone liked it. Some people pretended not to see her. Others made sure she knew she didn't belong, but she kept showing up, kept judging fairly, kept holding people accountable, even when it cost her. So that morning, when Officer Rourke slapped her across the face without even bothering to ask who she was, it didn't just insult her, it revealed everything he believed. That power had a look. That respect had a color. That authority came with a uniform and nothing else. But she knew better. She had earned her power the hard way, with scars, not shortcuts. And while he had the badge, she had the law. What he didn't realize, what he couldn't even begin to fathom, was that the second his hand met her skin, he wasn't just committing assault. He was opening a door, one that had been locked tight for years. A door people like him kept closed with politics, paperwork, and silence. And now that it was cracked open, she wasn't going to push it ajar. She was going to kick it off the hinges. That day wasn't about a slap. Not really. It was about everything behind it. The arrogance, the history, the entitlement, the belief that someone like him could walk into a courtroom and not even consider that a woman like her had more power sitting in silence than he ever had shouting orders. And when she finally spoke, calm, clear, and controlled, it wasn't just a statement. It was a warning, not to him, to all of them. Everyone who thought the system would always protect them, everyone who thought they'd always be above the law. The judge had taken the bench, and for the first time in his life, Rourke wasn't the one delivering judgment. He was the one receiving it. Officer Daniel Rourke had spent most of his career moving through rooms like he owned them. He was the kind of man who didn't just wear the badge, he wore the legacy. Third-generation law enforcement, father a retired captain, grandfather a local legend in uniform. He carried the weight of that bloodline like armor, and it had gotten him far. Every time a complaint landed, it vanished. Every time a civilian cried foul, there was a file, a favor, a friendly word upstairs to make it disappear. He never worried, never paused, because the system had always told him the same thing: you are protected. And so he started believing he was untouchable. The complaints were always the same: excessive force, verbal abuse, intimidation during routine stops. Once, even an accusation of planting evidence, though that one got buried so fast the ink hadn't even dried on the report. And every time he walked away clean. His record on paper looked almost perfect, because someone was always cleaning up behind him. A union representative, a buddy in internal affairs, a prosecutor who owed a favor. And when that kind of cleanup happens enough times, a man like Rourke stops seeing lines. He stops thinking they even exist. But that morning, standing in a courtroom, his hand still tingling from the slap he never should have delivered, he realized, too late, that he'd stepped over a line he didn't even know was there. Judge Eleanor James didn't need a gavel to bring justice crashing down. She just needed the truth. And this time, there were no shadows to hide in. There was no one to sweep it under the rug, because the rug had just been pulled out from under him. She didn't waste time. Once she took her seat on the bench and confirmed what everyone had just seen with their own eyes, she didn't raise her voice. She raised the stakes. Her questions came like surgical strikes. Did you strike me, Sergeant? Did you recognize me? Would you have done the same if I were a white man? And with every question, Rourke's confidence cracked. He tried to bluster, tried to justify, blamed the situation, blamed her appearance, said he thought she was part of the defense, that she surprised him, that she came at him. But it didn't matter, because what showed in his face, in his tone, in his very posture, was the same thing Eleanor had seen for decades: the disdain, the assumption, the automatic belief that anyone who didn't look like power must not have it. And when that assumption shattered, all he had left was fear, because the woman in front of him wasn't someone he could intimidate. She was someone who could end careers. But what made this moment different wasn't just the slap or the setting. It was the audience. This wasn't whispered behind closed doors. This wasn't a dash cam that could malfunction or a witness who could be discredited. This was public, open, witnessed. The courtroom didn't just hear the slap, they felt it. And when she began to speak, to name what had happened, to strip away every excuse, something shifted. Not just in that room, but in the system surrounding it. The moment she ordered the courtroom record to include Rourke's admission, it was like firing the first shot in a war long overdue. She wasn't just defending herself, she was going on offense. She requested the video footage from the courtroom cameras. She asked for copies of the complaints previously filed against him. She instructed her staff to pull every case where his name appeared, every arrest, every testimony, every fingerprint, not for curiosity, for audit, because she knew, you don't clean rot with air freshener, you dig it out. And the deeper she looked, the more the stench rose. Behind his badge there were patterns, a trail of reports that never led anywhere, a familiar cluster of prosecutors who always declined to charge, supervisors who turned a blind eye, and names that kept reappearing, attorneys, detectives, clerks, all part of a quiet network designed to protect men like him, not because they were good, but because they were theirs. It wasn't just Rourke who was guilty. He was just the most arrogant, the most visible, the one who got too comfortable. But Eleanor, she was done being comfortable. She had played by their rules for 30 years, stayed quiet, took the high road, gritted her teeth through every backhanded compliment and every suspicious stare. She knew what it cost to get that robe, to keep it, and now she was going to use it for exactly what it was meant to do, not to protect power, but to protect people. Starting with the teenage boy Rourke had dragged in that morning like a trophy, a vandalism charge, spray paint, barely 16, scared, alone, and nearly invisible, until that slap turned all eyes toward the courtroom. Because what Rourke didn't realize when he hit her was that he wasn't silencing someone. He was waking her up. And the city, the system, the press, they were about to find out what happens when the wrong judge gets hit at exactly the right time. The courtroom emptied slowly that day, but Judge Eleanor James didn't. She stayed seated, unmoving, her hands folded neatly on the bench, her mind already moving through the next steps. Not just of a complaint, not just of a hearing, but of a reckoning. She knew that this wasn't about one slap. It never had been. It was about a man who had been shielded for years, and more than that, it was about the invisible scaffolding that had held him up, the unspoken alliances, the selective silence. The rot didn't start with Officer Rourke. He was just the mold that grew on the surface. Within an hour, she had summoned her longtime bailiff, Carter, a man she trusted like family. She told him plainly, "I want every case Rourke has ever touched. Arrest reports, testimonies, complaints, internal reviews, everything." Carter didn't ask why. He just nodded and started pulling strings. Then she called internal affairs directly, no middlemen, no waiting on protocol, and requested an emergency investigation. The usual process was to let things simmer, to quietly pass the issue up the ladder. But this time, Eleanor skipped the ladder entirely and lit it on fire. By the time the sun dipped below the city skyline that evening, files were already arriving at her chambers. Boxes stacked on her desk, folders so thick the clips were buckling, documents that hadn't seen daylight in years. She reviewed every name, every redacted line, every complaint marked inconclusive or unsubstantiated without real explanation. And it was all there. The pattern was unmistakable. Cases where evidence had gone missing, body cams that failed to record at crucial moments, witness statements that had been altered or filed incorrectly, over a dozen excessive force complaints in 10 years, all dismissed, all buried, and almost every one of them followed the same rhythm. Rourke made the arrest, ADA Ramsey declined to prosecute, and no one ever followed up. That night, she didn't sleep. She read, she highlighted, she made notes, and as she flipped through page after page of buried pain, of lives upended and erased with signatures, she saw it clearly. This wasn't about one bad officer. This was a network, a machine, designed not just to protect itself, but to punish anyone who questioned it. Rourke was the face of it, but he wasn't the brain. He wasn't the muscle. He wasn't even the designer. He was just the tool. The next morning, Eleanor called a meeting with federal investigators. She laid it all out, the history, the evidence, the implications. The agents didn't blink. They'd heard whispers before, seen slivers of this kind of thing in other cities, but no one had ever handed them a map. Not like this. They brought in Agent Rosalind Keene, a seasoned investigator known for her no-nonsense approach to internal corruption, and Agent Felix Reyes, a sharp, relentless analyst who could follow digital footprints like a bloodhound. Together they began cross-referencing files, tracking connections, and reconstructing cases piece by piece. And that's when the threats began. At first they were small, a voicemail with nothing but breathing, a single word scratched into her office door, back. Then came the texts, unlisted numbers, vague warnings, reminders that she had a family, that people close to her could be hurt. One morning, a package arrived with no return address. Inside was a photo of her nephew, taken from behind, biking home from school. No message, just the image, just the implication. That's how they operated. No need for words when fear could say everything. But they had made a mistake. Because Eleanor wasn't afraid of shadows, she had lived her life under them. She knew what it meant to be watched, to be underestimated, to be threatened. And now, the very tactics they used to silence others only made her louder. She didn't back down. She expanded. She called in the U.S. Marshals for protection. She moved her family under watch. And she called the mayor's office not to ask for help, but to warn them, if you're not on the right side of this when it breaks, you'll be on the wrong side of history. Still, the machine pushed back. A motion was filed to have her removed from Rourke's case. The district attorney's office claimed she was emotionally compromised, that her involvement created a conflict of interest. The ethics board received anonymous concerns about her ability to remain impartial. The whispers were moving through the system now, trying to isolate her, to discredit her before she could drag too many names into the light. But Eleanor saw it for what it was, a coordinated effort to make her the problem, to turn her into the story so they could bury the real one. She met the moment not with denial, but with a declaration. She filed her own request for a public hearing. She wanted everything on the record, every document, every motion, every face involved. No more closed doors, no more backroom deals. If they were going to try to silence her, they were going to have to do it in front of the entire city. And still, the messages came, now more aggressive, now more personal. One text read, "Nice house. Shame if anything happened to it." Another, "You're going to cost people their lives." But by then, it was too late. She had already chosen her path. She wasn't just trying to punish a cop. She was trying to dismantle a system that had protected the wrong people for too long, a system that made victims out of the innocent and survivors out of the strong. And now that system was cracking. Because once the truth starts moving, once the threads start unraveling, it's only a matter of time before the whole thing falls apart. Eleanor wasn't waiting for permission. She wasn't asking for approval. She had turned the wheel herself. And what was coming next wasn't a trial. It was a reckoning. The deeper they dug, the more names surfaced. And not just names, patterns. Evidence that had been labeled as missing suddenly existed in archived databases under altered labels. Bodycam footage from incidents that had once been dismissed as unavailable showed up on drives that had been mislabeled intentionally. Witness statements that contradicted Officer Rourke's reports had been edited, rewritten, or replaced altogether. It was no longer just a case against one man. It was becoming a sprawling indictment of an entire justice system that had chosen preservation over truth. And Judge Eleanor James was at the center of it, not by chance, but by force of will. She read the files in long, relentless stretches, names of defendants who had pleaded guilty under pressure despite flimsy evidence. Young men, mostly black, mostly poor, who had been run through the court like cattle. Many of them had cases where Rourke was the arresting officer, and Ada Carson Ramsey had been the one to prosecute, or more often, the one to deal. Deals that stripped kids of years for charges that barely held weight. It was all there, quiet, patterned, polished to look legal, and rotten at the core. One name caught her attention more than the rest, a 17-year-old boy arrested in 2019. The case had been closed after a suspiciously short investigation. The charge? Assaulting an officer. The officer? Rourke. The evidence? A single bodycam video that had gone missing. The boy's public defender had pushed for access, filed a motion, then abruptly dropped the case. The boy took a deal. Eleanor's hands clenched as she read the summary. Something about the whole incident stank of coercion. The original complaint had been submitted anonymously to Internal Affairs and flagged for brutality, but it was never investigated. Why? Because the internal reviewer at the time had been none other than Captain Whitaker, Rourke's former training officer. That wasn't a red flag. That was a damn banner. And when Eleanor brought it to Agent Keene and Agent Reyes, both immediately started making calls. This wasn't just misconduct. This was collusion. This was corruption wearing a badge and hiding behind law degrees. Keane found more connections. Whitaker's name showed up in 3 other closed investigations, all tied to Rourke, all quietly dismissed. And in nearly every one, Ada Ramsey had either declined to prosecute or pushed plea deals through the system before anyone could ask too many questions. Eleanor sat with that knowledge, trying to process it, not as a judge, but as a human being. How many lives had been ruined to protect one man's image? How many futures stolen just to keep the system running smoothly? The court had functioned not as a place of justice, but as a factory of silence, and she had been part of it, not by choice, but by proximity, by trusting that others were doing their jobs with the same integrity she demanded of herself. That illusion was gone now, and in its place, only one question remained. How deep did it go? She didn't get to wonder for long. That evening, her phone lit up with a message that wasn't just a threat, it was a declaration. A photo of her nephew, walking home from school. The message, "Stay in your lane." No name, no signature, just those 4 words. She stared at the screen, her breath shallow, her pulse steady, cold and sharp. This wasn't about intimidation anymore. This was about war. Someone had crossed a line they couldn't uncross. She locked her chambers, called Carter, gave instructions, pull her nephew from school, get eyes on her sister's house, discreet. Trust no one outside the task force. Then she contacted the U.S. Marshals and the DOJ. This wasn't a local matter anymore. She was invoking federal jurisdiction. If they wanted to make her the enemy, she would become the most dangerous one they'd ever faced. Not because she was loud, not because she was angry, but because she was calm, focused, and fully committed. That same night, Rourke vanished from local custody. No official release, no statement, just gone. Moved quietly through a backdoor arrangement orchestrated by someone higher up. The kind of move that required approval from the very people being investigated. When Keane traced his last location, it led to a private facility, technically a contracted training site connected to a security firm. That firm, as it turned out, had direct financial ties to the mayor's re-election committee. It all came full circle. The rot had reached the top. Rourke wasn't just being protected, he was being positioned, and Eleanor knew what that meant. They weren't preparing to defend him in court. They were preparing to use him, to spin the story, to rewrite the narrative, and maybe even, if necessary, to take her out of it entirely. The messages had shifted in tone, not just threats, but strategy, a warning here, a whisper there. Someone wanted to make it clear, if she didn't stop, she'd lose more than her bench. But what they didn't understand was that she'd already made peace with the cost. The moment Rourke's hand hit her face, her role as a judge had changed. She was no longer there to simply interpret the law. She was there to defend the people the law had abandoned. She wasn't trying to salvage the system anymore. She was trying to remake it. So when the mayor's office sent a quiet message through back channels offering a resolution, she didn't even respond. When the ethics board tried to hold a private meeting to discuss her removal, she demanded it be public. When Ada Ramsey filed a motion to disqualify her from overseeing anything related to Rourke, she responded with a formal statement calling for a full audit of every case they'd handled together. And then she called a press conference. Not to posture, not to defend herself, but to reveal the truth, to name names, to show the public what had been hidden in sealed files and confidential memos for years. She held the file in her hands, a folder that connected Rourke to prosecutors, officers, commanders, and even judges. 12 names, 12 people who had built careers off of corruption and silence. And she stood at the podium not in her robe, not behind her bench, but as a woman who had seen too much and refused to look away any longer. "This is not about vengeance," she said. "This is about truth. And I am not the one tearing the system apart. I am showing you the cracks that have always been there." They wanted to isolate her. They wanted her to doubt herself. They thought threats would make her fold. But all they did was prove her point. The house they had built was rotten, and now It was starting to collapse under its own weight. And Eleanor James? She was holding the match. When the marshals finally moved on Rourke, it didn't happen in a blaze of sirens or a dramatic raid. It happened quietly, in a half-lit downtown parking structure under the hum of flickering fluorescent lights. He was trying to disappear, duffel bag in hand, burner phone buzzing with instructions, and a Glock tucked under his coat. He was ready to run, or fight, maybe both. But what he wasn't ready for was the sound of his own name echoing back at him from the dark. Sergeant Rourke. 4 marshals stepped out from the shadows, weapons drawn, voices calm, not frantic, not panicked, controlled, certain. They weren't giving him a chance to explain. They weren't asking him to surrender. They were ending the illusion. He froze, gun half drawn, heart thundering, and in that split second, the space between decision and consequence, he blinked. Not because of fear, not entirely, but because for the first time there was no escape route, no supervisor coming to his rescue, no ADA to smooth it over, no hidden hand to erase the mistake. He dropped the gun, then the bag, then his knees hit the concrete with a dull, final sound, the sound of a man realizing the system that always lifted him up had finally let him go. Back at the courthouse, Eleanor received the notification at exactly 3:14 p.m. Rourke was in federal custody, unarmed, arrested without incident. She didn't react with a smile. There was no celebration, no fist-pumping triumph, because this wasn't justice yet. It was just accountability catching up with someone who had been sprinting from it his whole life. And the truth was, Rourke wasn't the end. He was only the beginning. In her office, files were stacked like dominoes, each one representing someone who had been swallowed by the system he served. Internal affairs agents worked through the night, alongside DOJ representatives, combing through redacted pages, reinstating sealed evidence, matching dates and signatures that had never been meant to align. One name at a time, the machine began unraveling. Ada Ramsey had already resigned in disgrace. He was under federal investigation, and his plea deal negotiations were rumored to involve naming colleagues. Captain Whitaker, long retired, had gone silent. His name whispered in 3 open investigations and at least 1 wiretap. 2 precinct captains were dismissed the same day Rourke was arrested. 3 officers turned state's evidence within 48 hours. And then came the shock that hit Eleanor like a knife to the chest. Judge Benjamin Halcroft, a name she hadn't just worked alongside, but once admired. The judge who had mentored her, the man who had sworn her in, the voice that had once called her the future of Charleston law now stood accused of signing off on 3 case dismissals that involved Rourke directly. One of them a civil rights complaint, one involving a sealed juvenile conviction, the third still under review. But the pattern was clear. He had helped keep the engine running, and now the engine was falling apart. When Eleanor read his name in the official indictment summary, her breath caught, not from surprise, but from the weight of it. Halcroft had been the last person she'd believed in during her early years in the judiciary, and now he was part of the very rot she had vowed to expose. The betrayal didn't make her pause. It sharpened her, because if even he had compromised his integrity, then nothing about this system could be left untouched. The city was changing. You could feel it in the streets. The protests were no longer just outside the courthouse. They had spread across neighborhoods. People who had never set foot in a courtroom were now attending city meetings, demanding answers. Families who had once been told, "It's just the way things are," were now asking why. The justice system wasn't just on trial. It was being audited by the people who'd been denied it for generations. And yet, Eleanor knew the risk hadn't disappeared. If anything, it had grown. The higher she reached, the more dangerous the silence became. They didn't just want to discredit her now, they wanted to erase her. Smear campaigns erupted overnight. Social media flooded with hashtags questioning her motives, her background, her family. Anonymous tips were sent to media outlets claiming misconduct, bias, and everything else they could think of. An old photo of her protesting as a student was posted online and twisted into something radical. The smear wasn't subtle. It wasn't even clever, but it was loud. They called her an activist judge, a threat to law and order, a political pawn. But what they didn't understand was that Eleanor had already let go of her reputation. The robe no longer defined her. The bench no longer limited her. They could smear her title. They could question her past. But they couldn't unwrite the truth. And the truth was spreading. She released a statement demanding a judicial review of every conviction Rourke had touched. She submitted a federal request to freeze any case linked to Ada Ramsey until it could be reviewed independently. She demanded a press conference, not to defend herself, but to defend the facts. And at that podium, standing in front of a crowd that had come to see the aftermath of justice in motion, she made it clear. This isn't about one man. This is about a structure that raised men like him, protected them, rewarded them, and punished those who spoke out. That ends now. The crowd erupted in applause. Reporters captured every word. And for the first time in the city's long, tangled history with race, power, and law, there was a collective shift, not just in mood, in movement. 2 weeks later, the federal courthouse was standing room only. Marshals lined the walls. Protesters and legal observers packed the square. Eleanor didn't sit on the bench that day. She sat in the front row, called to testify as a witness. When asked what happened that morning in her courtroom, she answered plainly, "I was struck by a man who believed I didn't belong. That moment did not begin my fight. It simply made it visible to everyone else." When Rourke was convicted on all counts, assault, obstruction, conspiracy, intimidation, perjury, it wasn't just a courtroom win. It was a signal, a rupture in the wall that had protected the powerful. But he wasn't the real story anymore. The real story was what followed. Over 140 convictions were placed under review. A statewide investigation into judicial misconduct began. A new civil rights commission was formed. The governor, under pressure, announced sweeping law enforcement reforms. The Charleston Police Department was placed under federal oversight. And for the first time in the city's memory, people who had spent their lives being silenced were now being asked to speak. Eleanor returned to the courtroom where it all started, not to preside, but to resign. She stood before the State Judiciary Review Board and said the words with grace and clarity. "I believe in the law. I believe in its power to protect, to punish, and to heal. But I also believe that when a system is broken, it must be rebuilt, not by those who upheld it, but by those brave enough to demand better. I lit a fire. It is not mine to stand in. It is mine to pass forward." She walked out, not with a title, but with a legacy. She wasn't there to be the face of change. She had become its catalyst. And as she returned home, back to her family, to her porch, to her nephew, who hugged her tighter than ever before, she knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something much harder, much longer, but finally something honest. Because she didn't just bring justice, she made sure it had a voice.